was it like on the set of Little House on the Prairie? The actress who played Michael Landon's wife says it wasn't as wholesome as it seemed.
There are television moments that linger in the cultural memory for decades. Moments so unexpected, so emotionally raw, that they become permanently woven into the fabric of broadcast history. The ending of Little House on the Prairie is one of those moments. For 9 seasons, from 1974 to 1983, millions of American families gathered around their television sets every week to follow the Ingalls family through the trials and triumphs of pioneer life on the Minnesota frontier. It was comfort television in the truest sense, warm, moral, and deeply human. So when the final chapter arrived, nobody could have predicted that it would end not with tears and tender farewells, but with explosions. What happened at the conclusion of Little House on the Prairie remains one of the most debated, most analyzed, and most misunderstood finales in television history. Decades later, people still ask the same questions. Why did the show really end? Was it cancelled? Was it taken off the air because of that shocking scene? And who exactly was responsible for one of the boldest, most destructive decisions ever made on a network television production? To answer those questions properly, you have to go back to the very beginning, to the man who built Walnut Grove, and who ultimately chose to burn it to the ground. Michael Landon was not simply an actor playing Charles Ingalls. He was, in every meaningful sense, the soul of Little House on the Prairie. Long before the show premiered, Landon had already proven himself a television force through his years on Bonanza, but Little House gave him something far more powerful than fame. It gave him creative control. As the show's star, head writer, director, and executive producer, Landon shaped the series in his own image. That was both its greatest strength and, eventually, the source of its most significant tensions. Under his leadership, Little House became something far more complex than the gentle pioneer drama audiences might have expected. Landon was determined to use the frontier setting as a stage for exploring the full range of human experience: grief, addiction, racism, injustice, and loss. He believed that family audiences deserved stories that challenged them, not just comforted them. And week after week, the show delivered exactly that, walking a careful line between heartwarming resolution and honest, sometimes brutal, storytelling. The result was a show that resonated deeply with viewers across generations. At its peak, Little House on the Prairie was consistently ranked among the top programs in American television. Families trusted it. Parents watched alongside their children. Critics who initially dismissed it as sentimental fluff gradually came to acknowledge that something more ambitious was happening beneath its pastoral surface. Landon had quietly built one of the most emotionally sophisticated dramas on primetime television, dressed in calico and covered wagon dust. But as the early 1980s approached, the landscape of American television began to shift dramatically. New programs were competing aggressively for audience attention. Tastes were changing. Ratings for Little House started to slip, and NBC, watching the numbers decline, made the decision that the show had run its course. The network was ready to move on. The cancellation of Little House on the Prairie was not a sudden, dramatic event. It was a gradual corporate decision driven by falling ratings and the evolving priorities of NBC's programming strategy. By the time the network formally announced that the series would conclude after its 9th season, most industry insiders weren't particularly surprised. What nobody anticipated was how Landon would choose to say goodbye. In television history, series finales tend to follow a recognizable pattern. Long-running shows typically close with reunion episodes, sentimental callbacks to beloved characters, and carefully constructed emotional payoffs designed to reward loyal viewers. Landon, characteristically, had something entirely different in mind. He was not interested in a tidy, comfortable farewell. He was interested in making a statement. The final chapter came in the form of a television movie titled Little House, The Last Farewell, which aired in 1984. In it, a ruthless land baron arrives in Walnut Grove with legal documents claiming ownership of the entire town and its surrounding land. He demands that the residents vacate immediately, leaving behind everything they have built over generations. Faced with the prospect of handing their homes, their church, their school, and their community over to a man who intends to exploit the land purely for profit, the townspeople of Walnut Grove make a collective decision, one that would leave audiences across America staring at their television screens in stunned disbelief. Rather than surrender Walnut Grove to the land baron, the residents decide to destroy it themselves. Building by building, family by family, they pack explosives and detonate the very structures that had defined their lives, and that had defined nearly a decade of television history. The schoolhouse collapses. The mercantile crumbles. Homes that viewers had watched the Ingalls family eat and laugh and grieve inside are reduced to smoldering rubble. It was, by any measure, one of the most shocking conclusions ever broadcast on American network television. Here is where the story takes a turn that most casual viewers never knew about. The destruction of Walnut Grove in The Last Farewell was not achieved through camera tricks, clever editing, or the kind of practical illusions that television productions routinely relied upon. Landon ordered the physical set, the actual buildings constructed for the show on a ranch in Simi Valley, California, to be demolished with real explosives. The decision was deliberate and deeply personal. For years, Landon's relationship with NBC had been deteriorating. He felt that the network had failed to respect what Little House had accomplished, that they had treated it as a product rather than a legacy. When it became clear that the show was ending, Landon refused to leave behind a set that NBC or any other production company could simply repurpose for another project. He would not allow Walnut Grove to become the backdrop for someone else's story. If the town could not continue as the home of the Ingalls family, then it would not continue at all. Cast members who witnessed the demolition described the experience in deeply emotional terms. For many of them, those buildings were not just props. They represented years of shared work, real relationships, and formative experiences. Watching them fall was, as several cast members have recalled, like attending a funeral, a necessary ending, but an aching one. Melissa Gilbert, who had grown up on that set from the age of 10, later described the final farewell as both devastating and somehow right, a conclusion that matched the emotional honesty the show had always tried to maintain. This is the question that has followed The Last Farewell for more than 4 decades, and the answer requires some careful unpacking. Little House on the Prairie was not cancelled because of the finale. It was not pulled from the air as punishment for the destruction of Walnut Grove. The series had already concluded its run due to declining ratings and a mutual, if contentious, agreement between Landon and NBC. The finale was produced and broadcast as a deliberate closing chapter, not as a consequence of any controversy. What gave rise to the myth that the show was taken off the air is a combination of factors, each building on the other over time. First, The Last Farewell was rarely repeated in syndication. Networks and local broadcasters who wanted to air Little House reruns naturally gravitated toward the lighter, more family-friendly episodes from the earlier seasons, the ones without dynamite and devastation. The finale's bleakness made it commercially unattractive for repeat broadcasts, and so it gradually faded from regular rotation while the rest of the series continued to air for years afterward. Second, the sheer unexpectedness of the finale created a kind of collective shock that lodged itself in the cultural memory. Viewers who watched Walnut Grove blow up never forgot it. The image was so far outside the emotional register they associated with the show that it felt, in retrospect, like something that shouldn't have been allowed to happen, like something that had been stopped or suppressed. Over years and decades, the story of the finale became layered with mythology, with people half remembering that it had been controversial, assuming that controversy must have had consequences, and repeating the narrative that the show had somehow been taken away from audiences as a result. The truth is quieter and more complicated. Little House on the Prairie ended because its moment had passed, because television was changing, and because Michael Landon refused to let it die quietly or be forgotten on someone else's terms. No account of Little House on the Prairie's ending would be complete without acknowledging the friction that defined the show's later years behind the camera. Landon's absolute creative authority, while responsible for much of what made the show great, also generated real resentment among cast and crew members who felt sidelined or disrespected. His relationship with Karen Grassel, who played Caroline Ingalls, was particularly strained. Grassel later spoke publicly about feeling undervalued financially and professionally throughout the show's run, describing a pattern in which her requests for compensation equal to that of other NBC drama stars were dismissed or ignored. The irony of playing the warm, dignified matriarch of the Ingalls family while feeling professionally diminished off-screen was not lost on her, and she has spoken candidly about how that tension shaped her experience of the show. Landon's relationship with NBC followed a similar arc. He believed deeply that Little House had more story left to tell, that with the right creative investment the ratings could be recovered. The network disagreed, and the resulting standoff produced a compromise. The series would end after season 9, with a short-lived spin-off, Little House, A New Beginning, offering Laura and Almanzo's story a brief continuation. Without Landon at the creative center, however, the spin-off struggled and lasted only a single season, largely confirming what Landon had always argued, that his vision was inseparable from the show itself. It was this accumulated frustration with NBC, the sense that the network had never fully understood or honored what Little House was, that fed directly into his decision to destroy the set. The demolition of Walnut Grove was, among other things, an act of creative defiance. It was Landon asserting, in the most permanent way imaginable, that this story belonged to the people who had lived it, not to a network, not to a corporation, and not to whoever might come next. In the years since Little House on the Prairie left the air, its reputation has undergone a genuine and fascinating re-examination. Audiences who grew up with the show have returned to it as adults and found something more complicated than the wholesome comfort they remembered. The episodes that tackle addiction, assault, grief, and racial injustice feel, in many cases, more ambitious and more honest than the show's sentimental image suggests. Critics and scholars who once dismissed it as cornball nostalgia have reconsidered, acknowledging that Landon and his team were doing something genuinely difficult, using the conventions of family entertainment to tell stories that family television almost never told. The finale remains the most polarizing chapter of that legacy. Some viewers who watch it today find it powerful and fitting, a conclusion that refuses to sentimentalize loss or wrap 9 years of human experience in a neat ribbon. Others still find it jarring, even nihilistic, an ending that destroyed something beautiful out of pride and stubbornness. Perhaps both responses are valid. Great television, like great literature, rarely offers easy answers. What is certain is that Little House on the Prairie did not go quietly. It went the way Michael Landon lived, loudly, defiantly, and entirely on its own terms. And 40 years later, people are still talking about it, still debating it, still watching those buildings fall and trying to understand what it meant. That, more than any ratings figure or critical verdict, is the truest measure of a show's lasting power.